Good evening. Tonight we begin with a moment that is not loud, but is heavy. A statement issued, a response returned, and a familiar tension settling back into place. Earlier this week, the Cuban government issued a public condemnation of a recent executive order from the United States. The order threatens tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba. Havana described that move in stark terms, calling it a brutal act of aggression. Those are not words chosen casually. They were selected carefully, deliberately, and placed into a formal statement meant to be read by the world. The Cuban government accused Washington of blackmail and coercion, and said the measure seeks to isolate the island and undermine its sovereignty. That is the setup. That is the full frame. An executive order from the United States, a response from Cuba, and language that signals escalation. Now, before we go any further, it is important to be precise about what is happening here. The U.S. action at the center of this is an executive order. It threatens tariffs. Not sanctions, not diplomacy, not negotiation. Tariffs. Specifically, tariffs aimed at countries that sell oil to Cuba. Cuba's response does not focus on technical trade mechanisms. It focuses on intent, on what Havana says the order is designed to do. The statement says the United States is attempting to isolate the island. It says the order is meant to undermine Cuban sovereignty. It frames the policy not as an economic tool, but as pressure, as force. And the tone of the response matters, because this is not a quiet diplomatic note passed behind closed doors. This is public. This is declarative. This is meant to be heard. There is a line in the Cuban statement that stands out, not because it adds information, but because it adds weight. This is a brutal act of aggression, short, sharp, final. You can almost hear it being read aloud. Now, when the Cuban government uses language like blackmail and coercion, it is not describing process. It is describing posture. It is telling us how it interprets the intent behind the executive order. The statement accuses Washington of trying to force behavior, to compel compliance through economic threat. It presents the tariffs not as a neutral policy lever, but as a means of pressure applied from the outside. And again, this is all happening in the open. This is not inferred. This is not implied. It is stated plainly in the Cuban response. The United States, through this executive order, is threatening tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba. That is the action. The Cuban government's answer is to say, this is aggression, this is blackmail, this is coercion. There is no soft language here. There is no hedging. The statement does not say it could be seen as aggressive. It says it is aggressive, and it places that aggression in a larger frame. Havana says the action seeks to isolate the island, to cut it off, to narrow its options. That claim is central to the response, because isolation is not a side effect in this telling. It is the goal. The statement says the United States is acting to undermine Cuban sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word that carries legal meaning, historical meaning, emotional meaning. It is not about trade flows alone. It is about control. And again, the Cuban government is not speculating here. It is not offering analysis. It is making an accusation. Now, all of this unfolds against the backdrop of tariff enforcement. That phrase matters. Because the issue is not just the threat itself, but the enforcement of that threat. The Cuban statement underscores escalating tensions between Cuba and the United States in this context. Escalating tensions. That is not a dramatic flourish. That is a description of trajectory. Tensions are not static. They move, they rise, they escalate. And this, according to Havana, is another step upward. There is a rhythm to statements like this. They begin with condemnation. They move through accusation. And they end by situating the moment within a broader strain in the relationship. This one follows that pattern closely. The executive order is framed as an act. The response is framed as a defense. And the space between the two is filled with language meant to clarify positions. One side threatens tariffs tied to oil sales. The other side says, this is an attempt to isolate, to coerce, to undermine. Nothing in the statement suggests misunderstanding. There is no confusion claimed. The Cuban government is saying it understands exactly what the United States is doing, and it rejects it. There is a moment in the statement where the tone shifts slightly, not in content, but in cadence. It moves from describing the action to naming its effect. The effect, Havana says, is pressure. Pressure that reaches beyond Cuba itself, extending to other countries through the mechanism of tariffs. And that is where the accusation of blackmail comes in. Because tariffs, in this framing, are not about trade fairness. They are about forcing choices. The Cuban government is saying, this order tells other countries, if you sell oil to us, there will be consequences. And that, they argue, is coercion. Again, that is not my characterization. That is the language used in the statement. There is a kind of stillness to this moment. No pictures moving in the background. No dramatic visuals. Just words, statements, responses. And sometimes, that is where the most important signals are sent. This is not just policy, the statement seems to say. This is intent. There is one short line in the response that feels almost like a pause, a breath taken before continuing. It seeks to isolate the island. That line does not explain how. It does not lay out steps. It simply asserts purpose. And then the statement connects that purpose to sovereignty, to the idea that external pressure is being used to shape internal outcomes. All of this is presented as part of an escalation. Not an isolated incident, but another point on a rising curve of tension between the two countries. The Cuban government is making clear that it sees this executive order as part of a broader pattern, not a standalone event. And in that sense, the statement is doing more than condemning a policy. It is drawing a line. It is saying, this action has meaning, and that meaning is hostile. There is no call to negotiate in the text, no offer to discuss. The focus is on naming and rejecting. A quote near the center of the statement captures that tone perfectly. We will not accept coercion. Simple, direct, heavy with implication. Again, it adds no new facts. It just crystallizes the feeling. As we move forward tonight, we are going to stay with the words on the page. We are going to follow the narrative that begins with an executive order and continues with a condemnation. Because sometimes, understanding a moment like this means slowing down, reading carefully, listening to what is being said, and just as importantly, how it is being said. This is the opening move in a story defined by statements, responses, and rising tension. And it is only the beginning. So let's stay right there, with the language itself, because that is where the center of this moment really sits. The Cuban government statement does not wander. It does not broaden the scope. It stays tightly focused on what it says the United States has done and what that action represents. At its core, the response is about pressure. Not metaphorical pressure, but applied pressure. Pressure created through an executive order that threatens tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba. That is the mechanism. That is the lever. And Havana's message is clear. This lever is being pulled deliberately. The statement accuses Washington of blackmail. That word is important because it implies intent. Blackmail is not accidental. It is not neutral. It is an action taken with the purpose of forcing behavior. In the Cuban framing, the threat of tariffs is not just economic. It is strategic. It is meant to shape decisions made by other countries. The logic presented is straightforward. If countries know they will face tariffs for selling oil to Cuba, they may stop doing so. And if that happens, Cuba becomes more isolated. That isolation, according to the statement, is not incidental. It is the goal. There is a kind of clarity in how this is laid out. The Cuban government is not guessing at motives. It is asserting them. The statement says the U.S. action seeks to isolate the island. Not that it might. Not that it could have that effect. It seeks to. And then the statement takes the next step. It links isolation to sovereignty. To say an action undermines sovereignty is to say it interferes with a country's ability to act independently, to make decisions free from external force. So the Cuban response is constructing a chain. Tariffs threaten third countries. Those threats reduce engagement. Reduced engagement isolates Cuba. And isolation undermines sovereignty. Every part of that chain is asserted plainly. There is no technical trade analysis here, no discussion of tariff rates or timelines. The focus is on meaning. And meaning is where tensions live. The statement also accuses the United States of coercion. That word, like blackmail, carries weight. Coercion suggests pressure that leaves little room for choice. In this telling, the executive order is not offering options, it is presenting consequences. And again, this is not framed as a misunderstanding. The Cuban government is not asking for clarification, it is not requesting dialogue, it is rejecting the action outright. There is a moment in the statement where the language sharpens even further. It describes the order as a brutal act of aggression. Aggression is not passive, it is an act taken against someone. To call it brutal is to emphasize severity. That phrase does not explain, it declares. And in a statement like this, declaration is the point. What we are seeing is not just a disagreement over policy, it is a dispute over interpretation, over what an action signifies. The United States issues an executive order threatening tariffs. Cuba responds by saying that order is an attack. That gap between action and interpretation is where escalation often happens. The Cuban government places this moment within the context of tariff enforcement. That context matters because enforcement implies follow-through. A threat alone is one thing. A threat backed by enforcement is another. By emphasizing tariff enforcement, the statement suggests this is not symbolic. It is operational. And that is why the language is so firm. There is a line in the statement that reads almost like a steadying breath. This violates our sovereignty. Short, declarative, unadorned, it does not expand, it does not justify, it simply states. That restraint is notable. The statement does not try to persuade emotionally. It tries to assert position. And that makes sense because the audience is not just domestic. It is international. By accusing the United States of blackmail and coercion, Havana is not only responding to Washington, it is signaling to other countries. It is saying, this pressure does not stop with us. It reaches you, too. The threatened tariffs are aimed at countries that sell oil to Cuba. Those countries are part of this equation, whether they want to be or not. So the Cuban response serves multiple purposes at once. It condemns the U.S. action. It defines its meaning. And it calls attention to its broader impact, all without adding a single new factual claim. The statement underscores escalating tensions between Cuba and the United States. That phrase is almost understated, given the language elsewhere. Escalating tensions is diplomatic shorthand. It acknowledges strain without dramatizing it, but placed alongside words like brutal, blackmail, and coercion, the understatement becomes telling. It suggests a relationship already under stress, now pushed further. There is no reference to reconciliation here, no indication that this is a temporary disagreement. Instead, the statement reads like a marker, a point noted on a timeline of strain, and that timeline matters. Because when governments issue statements like this, they are not just reacting. They are recording. They are creating an official account of how they see events unfolding. This account will be referenced later. Quoted, returned to. That is why the wording is so careful. The Cuban government says the action seeks to isolate the island. That island language is evocative, but it is also literal. Cuba is an island. Isolation has practical consequences. But again, the statement does not enumerate those consequences. It does not describe shortages or disruptions. It stays within the bounds of accusation. That discipline tells us something about the intent of the statement. It is not meant to argue details. It is meant to establish stance, and the stance is clear. This executive order is unacceptable. There is a quote near the end of the statement that feels almost like a closing line, even though it appears before the final sentences. We reject all forms of coercion. It is broad, it is categorical, and it leaves no room for exception. That quote does not introduce new information. It simply reinforces the position already laid out. As a piece of communication, the statement is doing exactly what it is meant to do. It is naming an action, assigning meaning, and signaling resistance. And in doing so, it escalates not through new facts, but through language. That is often how escalation begins. The United States executive order exists as a legal document. The Cuban response exists as a political one. Between them is interpretation, and interpretation, once made public, becomes part of reality. Nothing in the statement suggests ambiguity. There is no suggestion that this could be resolved quietly. Instead, The Cuban government is telling the world how it sees this moment, and by extension, how it will respond to similar actions. It is saying, pressure will be named as aggression, and that naming matters. Because once something is called aggression, the range of acceptable responses narrows. Again, this is not speculation. This is about the power of words in official statements. The Cuban government is choosing words that harden positions, and by doing so, it underscores the reality of escalating tensions between the two countries. No images, no movement, just a person speaking words that were written carefully, deliberately, and with full awareness of their weight. This is a brutal act of aggression. That line echoes because it is meant to. And as we continue, we need to look at how this moment fits into the broader pattern described by Havana itself, without stepping outside the facts on the page. And so we come to the end of what is, on its face, a very contained exchange. An executive order issued by the United States, a formal condemnation issued by the Cuban government, and a relationship described once again as tense and tightening. The Cuban statement does not drift at the end, it does not soften, it closes the same way it opens, with clarity and firmness. It reiterates that the U.S. action threatens tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba. It repeats that this threat is viewed as blackmail and coercion, and it restates that the purpose, as Havana sees it, is to isolate the island and undermine its sovereignty. There is a sense of finality in how this is written, not finality in the sense of resolution, but finality in tone, as if the Cuban government is saying, "This is our position, fully formed, and it will not be adjusted." The statement underscores escalating tensions between Cuba and the United States. That phrase appears again, anchoring the entire response in a broader condition rather than a single dispute. Escalating tensions are not explained here. They are acknowledged. That choice matters, because it signals that this moment is not exceptional in isolation, but part of a continuing pattern. The Cuban government does not list previous actions. It does not compare this order to past measures. It simply situates the present moment within an ongoing strain, and by doing so, it closes the statement without opening new doors. There is a line near the end that feels intentionally restrained. Our sovereignty is not negotiable. It is short, it is declarative, and it carries emotional weight without introducing any new information. That is the kind of line designed to be remembered. The structure of the statement itself mirrors its message. Tight, controlled, unyielding. It begins with condemnation, moves through accusation, and ends with assertion. There is no call for dialogue, no appeal for reconsideration, no suggestion of compromise. Instead, there is a clear delineation of boundaries. The executive order, in this framing, crosses a line. And that line is named. By calling the order a brutal act of aggression, the Cuban government is not just criticizing policy. It is defining how it interprets the action at the highest level. Aggression implies intent. Brutal implies severity. Those words are not chosen lightly in official communication. They are meant to signal seriousness, both to the country issuing the order and to the international audience watching closely. The accusation of blackmail and coercion reinforces that signal. Blackmail suggests leverage applied unfairly. Coercion suggests force without consent. Together, they form a picture of pressure exerted beyond acceptable bounds, at least in Havana's view. And again, this is not framed as a misunderstanding. There is no request for explanation. The statement assumes clarity on both sides. That assumption is important because it means the disagreement is not about facts, but about legitimacy. The United States threatens tariffs tied to oil sales. Cuba says that threat is illegitimate, and that is where the matter rests, at least for now. The Cuban government's response is not long, but it is dense with meaning. Every phrase is doing work. The reference to isolation is particularly telling. Isolation is not just an outcome. It is described as an objective. By framing it that way, Havana is asserting that the executive order is designed to reshape relationships beyond bilateral ones. It pulls third countries into the equation. Countries that sell oil to Cuba are now implicated by the threat of tariffs, and that implication is central to the accusation of coercion. The Cuban statement is saying, this pressure extends outward, it affects others, and it does so deliberately. There is no attempt here to quantify impact. No economic projections, no timelines. The power of the statement comes from its restraint. It stays within its lane. It names the action. It names the intent it perceives. And it names the consequence. That is all. And sometimes, that is enough to mark a moment. As the statement closes, the emphasis returns to sovereignty. Sovereignty is the final word because it is the foundation of the argument. Everything else in the response flows from that concept. Isolation undermines sovereignty. Coercion undermines sovereignty. Blackmail undermines sovereignty. By threatening tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba, the Cuban government says the United States is interfering with its independent decision-making. That is the core claim. There is no embellishment beyond that. A short quote near the very end captures the emotional undercurrent without expanding the factual frame. We will not accept aggression. Again, it adds nothing new, but it resonates. It tells the listener how this moment is being felt, even as the statement avoids overt emotional language elsewhere. This is a statement designed to be read aloud, understood quickly, and cited accurately. It leaves little room for reinterpretation, and it does something else as well. It freezes the moment in official language. From here on, this executive order and this response will be linked. Any future reference to one will likely include the other. That is how official narratives form. The Cuban government has now placed its interpretation on the record. The United States' action is documented as a threat. Cuba's reaction is documented as condemnation. Between those two documents lies a clear line of disagreement. No images are required to understand this. No movement, no background noise. Just words spoken by one person, steady and deliberate. This is what escalation can look like at its earliest stages. Not dramatic gestures, but hardened language. Not action followed by action, but statement followed by statement. And tonight we have traced that language carefully, without stepping beyond what is written. An executive order threatening tariffs on countries that sell oil to Cuba. A Cuban government response calling that order a brutal act of aggression, accusing Washington of blackmail and coercion, and saying the measure seeks to isolate the island and undermine its sovereignty. A reminder, in closing, that tensions between the two countries are escalating in the context of tariff enforcement. That is the full frame. Nothing added. Nothing assumed. Nothing inferred beyond the words themselves. And with that, this account comes to a close.